Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Today we have to regrettably continue our 10 Flaws series by covering a ship I kind of don't want to cover at all, and that's the ARC 170 Reconnaissance Fighter. Having done so many different Republic vehicles lately in this series, you guys all correctly guessed that this ship was coming next. The ARC 170 has always been one of my favorite ships in Star Wars. Admittedly, upon first glance, I thought it was an ugly duckling, but the design grew on me, especially when I started noticing how much it resembled one of my favorite real-world aircraft, the A-10 Thunderbolt, aka the Warthog. I love the sound of rat in the morning. Now, every part of me wanted to do a video about how awesome the ARC 170 is and how it's the best medium starfighter in Star Wars. But it simply isn't. It has some major design flaws, and it also doesn't really fit the type of role it's designed for, and that's a pity because this is a great looking starfighter and it actually does have a lot of potential. Oh, and one more thing, because of the general lack of video for the ARC 170, we'll be using a lot of Battlefront 2 game footage. I apologize beforehand about my piloting skills. Had I been alive during World War II, I probably would have been volunteered into a kamikaze squadron. I think most people don't realize how large starfighters in Star Wars actually are, especially the ARC 170. A lot of that has to do with the fact that most of the time when we see starfighters, it's usually against the backdrop of the vastness of space or some epic battle featuring huge capital ships that also dwarfs it in size. But if we take something like the ARC 170 and put it next to something a bit more familiar, say like a school bus, we begin to see exactly how large it is. At 12.71 meters long, the ARC 170 was just as long as your average school bus, and with an enormous wingspan of 19.85 meters, it would almost be as wide as a 6-lane highway. In my opinion, that makes ARC 170 way too large to just be a simple fighter. As a matter of fact, if we put the ARC 170 next to the F-22 Raptor, one of the larger birds in our Air Force, we begin to realize just how unnecessarily large these ships are. And then perhaps the most important size comparison is just how small the ARC 170's main enemies are, the Vulture droid and the even smaller but deadlier droid Tri-Fighters. It comes to no surprise that when these small, cheaper droid fighters encounter the ARC 170, they usually won with their superior speed and maneuverability. And although the ARC 170 is classified as a long-range reconnaissance fighter, it was commonly used as a space superiority fighter and escort fighter. These were jobs that this fighter was ill-equipped to do because of its large size and lack of maneuverability. What made it worse, every time one of those cheap droid fighters took out one of these expensive ARC 170s, it also potentially killed the entire crew of 3. For some reason, the ARC 170 not only had a pilot, but also a co-pilot, rear gunner, and even an astromech. First, let's look at the rear gunner. In defense of the ARC 170, Star Wars space combat is usually fought at close ranges with unguided line-of-sight munitions. This isn't all that different from the type of combat we see in World War I, II, and to a lesser extent, in the Korean War and even the Vietnam War. And while bombers kept rear-facing guns all the way through the Cold War, fighter aircraft long ago abandoned this practice. For one, most engagements during the jet fighter age took place with missiles at longer ranges. Also, as aircraft became faster and more maneuverable, it became tougher and tougher to calculate bullet trajectory and hit enemy targets while moving so fast and twisting and turning all at the same time. Starfighters in Star Wars fly in open space where there isn't air resistance or gravity wells affecting flight speed. They also had advanced inertial dampeners to decrease the effect of gravity on crews, so these ships were capable of flying at much faster speeds, but also they were much more agile than even modern jet fighters, which consequently makes it even tougher for a rear gunner to hit anything at all. On top of that, laser cannons fired projectiles that are slower than the gunpowder weapons we use here on Earth, making things even more complicated. If you take a look at our own world, in World War II, most fighters had already abandoned using a rear gun and focused on maneuverability and speed over more rear-facing firepower. And without a rear turret and gunner, the aircraft also became smaller and lighter. As a matter of fact, the Republic Alliance famously took Republic-era Y-wings and removed the rear turrets and gunners for the same reason. As a long-range reconnaissance starfighter, I can assume that the ARC 170 is probably designed for longer missions. This is why the ARC 170 could hold enough rations for the entire crew for 3 to 5 days. Another redundancy measure the ARC 170 had was having a second pilot who sat between the pilot and gunner. This individual took over piloting if the main pilot was asleep so that, he didn't accidentally fall asleep behind the controls and fly them into a black hole or an asteroid. The co-pilot also had control over the forward-facing guns. Now, having your co-pilot arm and fire missiles is common practice. In our own Air Force, co-pilots are oftentimes referred to as weapons officers on dual-seat aircraft. Now in this case, the co-pilot not only controls the proton torpedoes, but also the forward-facing lasers, which in my opinion should be controlled by the pilot, who is more able to adapt to the movements of the ship. More importantly, for a recon ship, it would be more beneficial for the co-pilot to handle scanners and communications rather than just the weapon systems alone. But strangely enough, there's no mentioning of this role on the aircraft, and there's hardly any information about the scanner package on this ship. Now, what really makes the additional crew members unnecessary is the fact that there's an astromech bolted onto the back of the ship. With astromechs like R2-D2 and BB-8, these little robots are fully alive and intelligent AI beings. And in some ways, they're even more human than this robot trying to hit on Padme.
The closer I get to you, the worse it gets. The thought of not being with you, I can't breathe.
Now, the main reason that Starfighters have astromechs is for their advanced navigation and calculation abilities. It takes a tremendous amount of calculations and detailed star charts to properly calculate these jumps, otherwise you risk flying into a gravity well and having your flight plan delayed, or even worse. Most nav computers could have a few preset courses, but in order to make on-the-fly calculations, you really need a droid. Droids were also great co-pilots. They could manage the energy usage for all the systems on board, making sure the craft ran at maximum efficiency. They could also run diagnostics to find out problems on board and even potentially repair them. They could also use scanners and help with the communication process. Some astromechs like R2-D2 could even pilot the ship themselves and help fire the weapons. And an astromech is tiny and doesn't require too much additional space or creature comforts. It doesn't even need to eat or drink or go to the bathroom. I mean, look at the entire Separatist Navy, it's all droids. So having an astromech on top of a 3-man crew is just completely a waste. The ARC 170 is equipped with a decent hyperdrive rated at 1.5. In comparison, the Millennium Falcon, widely known as one of the fastest ships in the galaxy, had a Class 0.5 hyperdrive. Now, while the ARC 170 hyperdrive was pretty decent, especially compared to civilian ships, it actually wasn't really all that great when compared to other military hardware. To take a look at the Separatist Navy, the droid fighters were all battery powered and had limited range and no hyperdrives, but ships like the Separatist Providence class Dreadnought had a Class 1.5 hyperdrive as well, which could easily keep up with the ARC 170 in hyperspace, which kind of completely defeats the purpose of a recon ship. The recon fighter should be able to outpace a larger Separatist capital ship in case it jams its communications, and the ARC 170 needs to jump back to friendly space in order to give a physical report. Now, during the Galactic Civil War, only a few years later, both sides equipped 1.0 class hyperdrive, including the successor of the ARC 170, the Incom X-Wing. Another really odd design choice for the ARC 170 was the fact that it had extremely heavy lasers on its wingtips. I mean, look at just how ridiculously large these things are. These lasers were reportedly heavy enough to even pierce capital ship armor, making the ARC 170 perhaps accidentally a great strike fighter. This is also where the aggressive and aggressive recon comes from. The problem with this kind of heavier laser is that it consumes a larger amount of energy and produces a larger amount of heat, which means it can overheat quite quickly. So most of the time these lasers had governors on them to prevent overheating and even damage to the system. That meant these larger lasers had slower firing rates, which is actually quite a handicap in a dogfight. And for some reason, the ARC 170 just had these two giant lasers. It didn't have any additional smaller and more rapid firing laser cannons. On top of that, like the X-Wing, the ARC 170's lasers are on the wingtip, which means the pilot had to calibrate a point of convergence in order to hit objects, further complicating the whole firing process. So the ARC 170 was a huge aircraft. It's almost the size of a gunboat, really. And this made it not only easier to hit in a line-of-sight dogfight, but it also made it easier to spot on scanners. The ship also had massive heatsink radiators and foils on the wings due to its heavy laser, which increased its thermal footprint. These are opposite of the type of traits you would want on a reconnaissance craft. Recon aircraft here on Earth focus heavily on stealth capabilities, high altitude, and high-speed performance to stay out of reach of enemy fighters and missiles. The ARC 170, on the other hand, was just a flying tank, but more on that later. So as we mentioned before, larger lasers meant a bigger cooling system. Like the X-Wing, the ARC-170's entire wing structure was for cooling. You don't really need wings for spaceflight, and repulsors and inertial dampeners make lift unnecessary for in-atmosphere flights. Now, the problem with this radiator system is that there is no air in space, which means traditional heat sinks and radiators have a problem finding and conducting material to take away all that energy. If we look at the ISS, it uses an ammonia cooling system which leads heat away from essential systems into cooling fins that slowly radiates and dissipates the energy into space. The problem with the ARC-170's design is that the radiator and S-foils are located quite close to the center of the ship. A better position for S-foils would be on the tip of the wings, kind of like how the ETA Actis is designed. This pushes the heat out as far away from the rest of the craft as possible. This would also consequently put the lasers closer to the middle of the aircraft, ideally center aligned with the cockpit, making firing a lot easier. So the ARC in ARC-170 is short for Aggressive Recon, which kind of is a weird phrase. We're taught that reconnaissance is all about gathering as much information as possible, hopefully without being detected. That's why reconnaissance craft in general are usually small and operate in single or small units. The idea is the longer you can stay hidden, the more information you can gather. Aggressive reconnaissance almost evokes the idea of a skirmisher, a light unit designed to harass and poke enemy formations while looking for potential weaknesses. A great aggressive reconnaissance craft would be the Republic stealth ship used by Anakin against Admiral Trench. It had full cloaking measures and a large amount of proton torpedoes, which allowed it to make a quick strike and then go back into stealth mode. The ARC-170 was the opposite of stealthy, although it did have a lot of firepower. Now, my next question is, why are manned recon craft used in Star Wars at all? On our own planet, we have more or less phased out manned recon aircraft like the high-flying U-2 or Blackbird. We have satellites for strategic planning and smaller UAVs for tactical reconnaissance. The Star Wars universe is fully capable of creating similar drones, and the Empire was famous for using them to scout planets for hidden rebel bases. These unmanned scouts were extremely small and hard to detect, and more importantly, they were much cheaper, and they didn't endanger any living beings. Now you probably saw this next point coming from a mile away. The ARC-170 is not a reconnaissance craft. This designation is flawed and shows that the Republic military leaders misunderstood this craft's capabilities. Just like how Hitler wanted the Me-262 to function as a bomber for his revenge strikes, even though as a jet-powered fighter, it was clearly more suited to be a high-speed interceptor. If we take reconnaissance out of the name ARC-170, we're only left with aggressive, and that's what the ARC-170 is. With its large capital ship laser cannons, rear gunner, co-pilot who functions as a weapons officer, slower speed, heavier armor and shields, it's clearly an attack fighter. I mean, the thing even has giant cooling ducts for in-atmosphere flight, which is why it reminds us of the A-10 Warthog in the first place. The ARC-170 was really more of a fighter-bomber. Any craft slow enough to require a tail gunner and weapons officer better have the firepower to back up all that weight. Now, if we take a look at the ARC-170 using the parameters we would use for a fighter-bomber, now things are beginning to make a lot more sense. On the gigantic battlefields of Geonosis, an ARC-170 armed to the teeth could do some real damage against Separatist ground forces. So guys, that is our analysis of the ARC-170. Personally, one of my favorite ships in the Star Wars universe. I really do hope we get to see more of this craft. Hopefully we'll see it in the new season of Clone Wars, which is actually a deleted season that Dave Filoni is reviving. We do know that there is a major battle in this arc. So maybe we'll see the ARC-170 return to the battlefield, maybe making some ground attacks and shrugging off some laser blasts like a Warthog would. Well guys, thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button. As usual, if you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.